welcome to the Becoming Bohemian Book Club, and thank you so much, Sara, for joining us today.
Absolutely.
I,
Thank you for having me.
I wondered if you wouldn't mind, before you launch right into Zelda's story, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit more of your own story and how you came to be the path you walked to get to executive director at the Fitzgerald Museum.
Sure. So it's kind of a wayward one. I started off with a photography background, so ultimately that's what I went to school for. And then somewhere along the way, I kind of lost my motivation or kind of changed what I wanted to do. So I ended up working in kitchens and fine dining, and I did everything from catering to sandwich to being a barista. And then I became pregnant with my daughter and kind of had to figure out, I couldn't work 11 p.m. shifts and do dishes and clean fryers. So I got into nonprofits. I started working for the food bank here in Montgomery. I stayed with them for 5 years. I started off as a volunteer. I painted a mural for them and then ended up doing their data entry and then moved into what eventually was called a food solicitor, which basically established their corporate partnerships and maintained them. So I kind of worked my way through the nonprofit system and won a few awards for marketing and fundraising, so I had a niche for it. And I was at a job that I feasibly could retire at and be there my whole life. And I got a little antsy, and I saw that the director position came up for the Fitzgerald Museum, and the museum's a very special place in Montgomery. It's kind of a best-kept secret. A lot of people don't realize it's even here. We get more international visitors than we do local. And throughout my life, I've always lived in Montgomery, so throughout my life I always wanted to live on the property. It always had this kind of charm about it, and then I had a general passion for the Fitzgeralds. I started with their letters and then, of course, dove into the rest of their story. So the opportunity was there, and I just kind of went for it, and the rest is history. I've been on for almost a year. December 10th will be my year mark, and I don't anticipate leaving anytime soon, so it's really a dream job.
That's wonderful. Yes, I was very fascinated because I do think it sounds idyllic, like perfect kind of job, the perfect
Yeah,
place. It looks like it's beautiful from all the photos I've seen.
yeah, it is. It's funny that you say quaint because that's exactly what it is. I mean, we are in I'm in a home, so it's almost like you live here. And with the upstairs apartment, we've been furnishing the upstairs apartment, so it's almost like you're creating your own apartment. And it's little things like we were talking about the magnolia in the yard and the church bells going off every hour. It definitely has this charm to it. So.
Yeah, I can't wait to visit. So as we discuss the book, I thought it would be nice to sort of divide our discussion into some themes. And there are themes that I found through the book and that also correspond well with some of the topics that we discuss in our book club and on the blog. And so I thought we'd start with sort of philosophical themes and sort of psychological themes, because those are woven throughout Therese and Fowler's book. And so the one that you see come up very often and recur is this idea of home, and kind of this existential striving to find that place that you feel, is your place in the world. And
Yeah.
I noticed through the book, after leaving home in Montgomery to marry Scott in New York, Zelda and Scott are just constantly on the move from house to house, country to country. And so I just wanted to know, how you felt that constant displacement impacted Zelda.
Well, ultimately, it is a contributing factor, I think, to her mental health. But in terms of, not having that stability or not having a place that you can kind of anchor yourself to. But I think most of it comes with the glamour of the lifestyle that they led, and kind of an attempt in stability in their own way. They were trying to kind of invent themselves, or like their move to Europe was their excuse was to live a little more cheaply, but I think it was ultimately to kind of escape what was going on in the US at the time. And I think alcoholism is a big part in that. They say that alcoholics have a tendency to want to start over, or to kind of put themselves in a new environment. So I think if you really look at especially their early years, they're drinking very heavily. So, I mean, I think that's as much of a factor as anything else. I think, honestly, coming from Montgomery and having some familiarity with Zelda in that sense, it's hard to be in such a small city and see everything that's going on the outside and feel comfortable in staying there. So I think, Montgomery was certainly an anchor for her and was home for her, but at the same time, I don't think she ever wanted to go back. Even as much as they tried to go back, I think the world was too, I think there was too much to offer for both of them, and I don't think they would have done it any other way, honestly. I think the story would, be much less interesting if they had only moved once. So, yeah, but I mean, for them, it is a tale of tragedy. The timing is always off, So if any circumstance had ever presented itself in the right way, they may have stayed somewhere, But ultimately, I think it was a lot of extraneous factors that caused them to move on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how the author puts it, I think, on page 142 of the book. She says, there's a word for people who move from place to place, never seeming to be able to settle down for long, peripatetic. And there's a word for people who can't seem to stay out of trouble. Well, there are lots of words for such types. Unstable, irresponsible, and misguided are some of them. Trouble has lots of forms. There's financial trouble and marital trouble. There's trouble with friends, and trouble with landlords, and trouble with liquor, and trouble with the law. Every sort of trouble I can think of, we've tried it out, become expert at some of it, even so much so that I've come to wonder whether artists in particular seek out hard times the way flowers turn their faces to the sun. And I love that, because I think it illustrates just what you were saying, where...
Yeah, it really does. It's perfect. It brings in all of the elements. I mean, and that's the hardest part for me about telling their story, is that it's not about one person or another, or it's not about them together. I mean, it's about all of these extraneous factors that kind of play in. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true for anybody in life. I mean, there's a lot of things that are, out of your control in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, things beyond your control. And I think one of the things, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, was sort of the time, what was going on in the U.S., but also I think, time plays a little bit of a factor throughout this book, and in a lot of Scott's works, time comes up, the idea of kind of past, living in the present, and then the future. For me, I couldn't help but feel as I was reading that Zelda was very much avant-garde, very much kind of ahead of her time, it seemed, and in the way that she thought and the way she acted. And I don't know that she was fully aware that she was so kind of ahead of her time. And I wonder if that might have also contributed to her not quite finding a fit or finding a place. She didn't feel quite comfortable in Montgomery, wanted to get out and see the world and everything it had to offer. But then once she's in New York, she's kind of feeling out of place. She has her wonderful Southern accent and her Southern, the charms that she brought from Montgomery that maybe don't quite fit in New York, but she makes it work, and then moving to Europe as well, she just, I kind of wonder if she was a little ahead of her time, and that might have been why it was hard to find that home, that felt quite right.
Absolutely. I mean, you can tell specifically with her novel, that she's operating on a different plane than everybody else, even in her language. And I think that's the most indicative thing of Zelda, is her language. So, Southerners do have their turn of phrase and these certain little charming things that we kind of insert into our language. But she was a very descriptive, and I mean, she took so many things. it's hard to describe because you can tell at a very young age. There's an article that we're actually digging into some of the articles here in Montgomery about the Sayre family and Zelda, particularly when she was much younger and previous to Scott. And one of them, she mentions becoming a play, like she wants to put on plays and productions, and she's 11 years old at the time. And to have that kind of foresight and insight to your life, even really not knowing what's going to happen at that point or where you're going to end up. I mean, ultimately, that's what she did. Her paintings were set designs and costume designs. Her paper dolls were, costumes. So I think she always had an inclination to be a writer and a dancer and a creative person. It was just what environment she was in, or even situationally. So, she writes previous to Scott, but the time period, kind of inserted his name as the byline or used that as a marketing technique. Mm-hmm. And I think that's more indicative of the time period than any kind of plagiarism or manipulation on Scott's end. Just a personal opinion. With the ballet, again, she does that previous to Scott, and then when she re-immerses herself, I mean, they're financially having a hard time. They both had affairs in some sense. I always refer to them as friendly affections because they're not really necessarily sexual affairs. But they're enough. There's a schism in the marriage, if you will, and then she's taking it to a point of obsession. She wants it so badly that she's killing herself. Basically, she's just working herself to death over it. And they're isolated from each other, so it's just not a good. To be a creative, you kind of have to be supported in that sense. And I think that was both of their struggles. They were almost competitive in that way. They both wanted to be successful, and I think the time period and women's roles at the time are more of a hindrance than any other part of that conversation. I kind of strayed away from the topic, didn't I?
No, that's okay. But we'll actually be weaving a lot of the elements of what you were just saying, I think, into the discussion as we go along and kind of talk more about the art. But that's exactly right. I think I got the same sense too through this book that that role of women, it was starting to shift. We're starting to get through that suffrage movement, and women are having the right to vote, but it's a little clunky still working out, how gender roles and kind of what that means, and and the flapper identity. You've got that modern woman, but they're, it's tricky. It's not exactly a very linear, straight, clear-cut line to, that true kind of liberation of women being able to really move in the professional spheres that were accessible to men. And I can definitely see how that played a huge part, that she was just kind of ahead of her time, and maybe had she been born today, the outcomes might have been a little bit different, and perhaps her suffering would have been, not quite as intense as it was.
Yeah.
I think, back to kind of that identity and existential feeling, I think that identity and finding out the meaning of their existence is definitely something that both, Zelda and Scott struggled with through the book. And you kind of touched on that just in your recent comment and the one prior. And I think, I kind of wonder if that existential angst was sort of a common byproduct of the jazz age and modernity, and if so, why? I know you kind of alluded to that in your last comment, but if you want to expand on that, awesome. They
were a post-war generation, that's what I kind of say about all of Scott's material. People always ask, why is it relevant now? And I think all of the great movements kind of happen in this post-war society. The jazz age is the best, in my opinion. I think, if you look at just a handful of the characters, you look at the Fitzgeralds, both of them, Gertrude Stein, Hemingway, Dali, Picasso, Dorothy Parker. I mean, all of these people were in the same sphere and they were corresponding with each other. So even when you look, at each of them individually, there's these echo chambers that kind of pop up where they're talking about each other. So you get this whole picture of everybody as a group. But I think that's why they were so close and why they kind of, why this happened is because there was, this common angst, if you will, or I don't know. I think nobody had really dealt with anything like that in society and as a civilization. We have ultimately through time, but I think it just affected people in a different way, and they kind of reevaluated their lives and what they wanted to be and what they wanted to put out into the world. They always talk about Scott's writing, and even Zelda's was, it was based on their own perspective and their own lives. It was very personal, and I think that's why people relate to it even now, is because we all have this kind of existential angst that sticks with us. We're always going to be in a post-war generation. We're always going to have something that seems relative. So I think that's why they're timeless.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, speaking of that sort of timeless quality and existentialism, on page 204 of the book, it says, "This was Scott, this is Scott, always looking back to try to figure out how to go forward, where happiness and prosperity must surely await." And I think that's interesting, the was, the is, the past, the present, and how she kind of plays with that a little bit, the author does. I think I really like what you said about kind of the post-war generation. Last month we read Jack Kerouac's book On the Road. And he similarly, kind of World War II recently, and then kind of had that same, very similar experiences of kind of constantly on the move. And I think you see that here. They're looking for that meaning in life, and so they're kind of constantly moving and they're constantly striving kind of against the current, pushing against that resistance and kind of fighting for, to find that kind of elusive it is what you see in Kerouac's work, but I think you see it here too, just that how to go forward, where to find, where happiness and prosperity must surely wait, just that constant striving and never being fully satisfied, but making progress. And I think progress, obviously, it never comes easy, and so I think it's really interesting and important to learn about all of those characters you mentioned in this age of the jazz age, and because they really were such contributors to our modern era and to progress.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite story at the museum when we do tours is to talk about how Gatsby came into modern popularity, because it was a flop when it was published. Not necessarily according, in sales and finances and things like that, it was fine, but in terms of reception, it really wasn't well received. So it didn't come back into modern conversation until after World War II, because they issued Gatsby as an armed service edition, which was the pocket-sized editions that they would give to the soldiers during war. And they printed 150,000 of them, but it's estimated that over 2 million soldiers actually read it, because they would trade them back and forth almost like baseball cards. So when everybody comes back from World War II, Gatsby is just thrown into this modern popularity, and Scott never obviously sees this, but it's interesting that war was ultimately the thing that brought him back. It's almost as if he was ahead of his, it is as if he was ahead of his time. He was writing about something that was relative, decades later, in a whole different conflict in the future. So, and even Zelda in her writing, you can tell she's always talking about, there's always this if, or, I think even small things like her spending time in Montgomery's cemetery, in Oakwood Cemetery, which sounds odd, but Oakwood is kind of picturesque. It's on a top, like above downtown. You know, there's live oaks and moss and hills, and it's, you know, rolling and green, and it's really not what you would anticipate in terms of its cemetery. But I think that's her, you know, trying to connect with the past in some sense. So there is this kind of strange shift in time when you look at their whole story and even their writing and other things, you know, her art as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think kind of going back to, well, this idea of, you know, time and being ahead of your time. Um, I wonder, you know, would you say that some of Zelda's bipolar behavior was possibly due to this sort of cognitive dissonance that she may have experienced when Scott and, you know, and much of the Jazz Age sort of, like theology or, you know, of Flapper, you know, their that Flapper freedom and modern woman ideals that were starting to be more embraced, you know, that was being praised in sort of Scott's and lifted up in Scott's writings and other writings, but he wasn't quite as willing, at least through this book. You know, it was hard for him to kind of let her dance or let her sort of write independently without a byline. I know you sort of mentioned that a lot of it seemed to be kind of the product of the time that they were living in. You know, do you think that really contributed to her psychology, that it was kind of this conflict, and, you know, of on the one hand having the, you know, the modern era and women kind of rising up and being able to, you know, have a voice, but then kind of not necessarily being able to truly express that voice as freely as maybe it was beginning to be popularized by the Flapper movement?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a hard topic, and this is one of the reasons I really was invested in this job as well, is because, you know, you see with especially Zelda's material, they hit Scott hard on a lot of these topics, you know, whether it's plagiarism or the bylines or, I mean, not letting her dance or write or whatever it may be. And for me coming in, I want to defend them both. You know, it's hard. I have a love for both of them. So I try to look at it as subjectively as I can without trying to pit them against each other or even pick one side or the other. In terms of her behavior, so and her mental health, it's hard because she was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. So even her treatment was tailored to something that she may not have truly had. You know, it is said that she had more bipolar or mood disorder in addition to severe depression and other kind of issues. I always kind of throw postpartum as a factor because it wasn't really discussed during the time period. Again, that kind of going back to women and their roles in society at the time, it wasn't really addressed. And even in terms of the treatment of women and mental health facilities was a little archaic, if you will. So I think you have to kind of take all that in, and then you look at the Flapper. So one of the things I always point out when I talk about Zelda is there's this book that she read right before her marriage to Scott. It's called The Salamander by Owen Johnson, I believe. But it's basically a book that talks about elements of the Flapper before she is even coined as the first Flapper. So when you first read it, it talks about this independence and this motivation to be, you know, different than a domestic woman. And so I think she very much, and you see these themes come up even in her conversation and her writing, she's taking elements of these books and all these fantastic ideas that she's kind of read about and absorbed along the way, and then she starts applying them to her life, you know. So I think as much as she believed in it, I think it's like anything with celebrity or status in that it shifts, you know. You know, you start curating yourself. That's what I always say about the Fitzgeralds, is that they curated themselves very carefully. It's almost as if they knew people were watching them or were going to document them in some way because, they have extensive scrapbooks. They saved quite a bit, including their letters and correspondence. So I think a lot of it was the way they were publicly perceived. It's also shown that she did. I mean, they wrote together, so that's one thing I always like to kind of debunk. It's like at the beginning of their marriage and even before their marriage, they're trading their writing material back and forth, and they're discussing it, and they're critiquing each other's work. So even though she's not writing actively at the beginning, after his first novel is published, I mean, she writes The Millionaire's Girl. She writes the review of his novel. I mean, she did up to 10 short stories during that period of time. So even though she's not fully credited, I mean, she is responsible for a lot of that material, and I think she knew that. I think once it became a novel and once it became, if you look at Scott's career, particularly with Save Me the Waltz, when she's about to publish Save Me the Waltz, he hasn't published for almost 10 years. He hasn't published since 1925. She would send her novel to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, without his knowledge. So it's kind of this back and forth between them of, I didn't know about this. Yes, you did. So he ultimately gains the editing rights to her novel, which, again, they have these elements of drama, and they have this tendency to pull it out of each other and just pick at each other in this way. So I think the financial aspect and the downward spiral of his career are the biggest factors in him being competitive in terms of her being a writer. I think he felt as though he was meant to be more, and when that didn't play out for him, he resented her for being successful at it. And that's a hard thing. I mean, that's not the 20s. That's just, marriage and relationships. And I think that's the biggest thing when I talk about both of them is that they were so similar. They were both motivated. They were both intelligent and inspired and ahead of their time, but they just pulled these terrible things out of each other. They kind of, it was like oil and water in some cases. So I think, as much as he may have exacerbated that, I think it's also, again, the extraneous elements that kind of play into that. And I think her response is, the mental health aspect is so hard to talk about because there's not enough, there's a lot to go on, but there's not enough that's really her perspective and where she's coming from. It's either, doctor's records or correspondence between Scott or her mother, and you kind of get this like strange outward picture of what may be actually happening with her. So I've been kind of reading a lot. There's a new book out that I would encourage you guys to look into. It's called The Subversive Art of Zelda Fitzgerald by Deborah Pike. It's a new release, but I'm about 3/4 through it, and it's been, it was hard for me to start because she takes such a deep dive into the mental health aspect and the treatment and breaks down all of the things that we're kind of talking about, like, her writing and how, all of this kind of competition and, even not being a domestic woman played into everything else, and I think ambitious women were often considered crazy. So it's hard to say that she had bipolar or was even schizophrenic because it's very, I'm not a doctor, obviously, but in some cases she's very much sane. She very much knows what she's doing, and it's just a reaction, or it's just, I don't really know how to put it, but I think it's such a difficult thing to really pinpoint in terms of her behavior what the trigger was. I mean, even looking at her upbringing, her mother encouraged her to be, you know, beyond what people expected her to be. She, you know, if she was doing something wrong, she was like, oh yeah, just like live your life and don't worry about what your daddy has to say, you know? And in a Southern Christian conservative town, you know, she was a wild child. Even now people still balk at what Zelda did, and I think it's hilarious because we're in, you know, we're in a modern society. These things are not outrageous, you know. But she's still very much like I don't know how to describe it. A mover and a shaker, if you will. She's still shaking people up even now.
I love how you put that, and thank you for the book recommendation. We're always looking for good book recommendations, so I'll definitely put a link to that book on the website and on Facebook as well. Yeah, it's interesting too how you brought up her mom, you know, versus the judge, her dad, and thinking about, you know, perhaps if it was schizophrenia or bipolar or this just cognitive dissonance that she was experiencing. It's interesting to think about, you know, her upbringing and how she kind of had those two sides of herself, right? She had the judge, you know, in one ear, and she had her mother who was a little bit more libertarian with her parenting, you know, and I think, you know, poor Zelda must have experienced a lot of that kind of cognitive dissonance on the one side, maybe wanting to please, you know, her father's kind of the angel on her shoulder, and on the other side, you know, she has her mother kind of, you know, allowing her to really be herself. And so, you know, I can see that come up, kind of that father figure, and she refers to her father throughout the book quite a bit too. And so I kind of wonder if that, you know, she had that sort of side of herself that wanted to please him, you know, wanted to be a good child, but at the same time recognizing in herself this need to be free from sort of the constraints of that sort of law and order and rigid way of living. I think also it was interesting in the book towards the end when she has her exhibition of her artwork, and then there's a review in Time magazine, and the headline is "Wife," and she says, "Wife read the headline, and despite the praise that followed in the body of the review, I felt myself deflating. Work of a wife, that was it. WIFE, my entire identity defined by 4 letters. I'd been trying for 5 years to overcome. Why was it that every time I finally chose, every time I did, my efforts failed, I failed so miserably? Why was I so completely unable to take control of my own life? Was there any point to it for me? I thought it was Scott I'd been fighting against, but now I wondered if it was fate. When I was young, I believed that it would be awful to try at something only to find that you could never succeed. Now I knew I'd been right. I was not a sufficient dancer or writer or painter or wife or mother. I was nothing at all." And I think, you know, it is sort of tragic that I think there were so many facets to her life and so many sides of herself, you know, that it was hard, I think, for her to feel like she was successful at any of them. But I think objectively, as you read through, you realize, you know, she really was, you know, she was not only giving her best effort, but she was successful. It just may have been, again, going back to that not quite the right time, you know, period for her to be acknowledged as successful. And as so often happens with artists and, you know, writers, you know, it's often posthumously that they are, you know, identified and acknowledged for the geniuses that they really are, which is just part of the tragedy, I think.
Yeah. Well, even so her mother is a really, really interesting character on her own, and even her sister Rosalind. So again, kind of going back to some of the research that I've been doing recently, it's all Montgomery based, which is fascinating to see how Montgomeryism was versus now, which isn't a far stretch. But you think about all the things, I mean, Judge Sayer was post-Civil War. His laws ultimately impacted the Civil Rights era, so we are the timeline in between all of that, and it's fascinating to see the evolution. But her mother wrote plays that Zelda starred in and was one of the first contributors to the newspaper. Her sister was one of the first female bank tellers and also contributed to the newspaper. So I think she came from a line of women, and even her circle of women. You know, you look at Tulu, Bankhead, and the various Saras, Mayfield and Hart, and all of these women became something more than a Southern belle. You know, they made a point to leave Montgomery and leave Alabama and do something else. And her mother, and it's funny that you mentioned the judge. So the judge, Zelda refers to him as an iron fortress, and I think that's the best way to describe the judge. He was set in his ways, and that's the way it was. And I think that's indicative of many Southern men and the way that the South is kind of described. You know, that you kind of have this timid wife and like this, you know, stern man. And she was the baby of the family, so she was the frivolous one. Like all these elements are just, it's almost storybook in the way that it played out. But I think with her mother being, with her the females in her life being so strong, and kind of almost negating her father in a way by saying, no, you know, you can sneak out the window and go to this party, or you can, you know, you don't have to wear your stockings today, or, you know, I heard about you cartwheeling down Perry Street, you know, like, I think it was as much encouraged as it was discouraged, because it was like, you be who you want to be, you know, don't let anybody define you. And I think that's ultimately what motivated her to just kind of do everything.
So going back, you touched on, you know, Scott's alcoholism, and Zelda definitely indulged in her, you know, in quite a bit of alcohol herself, even during, you know, the Prohibition times. How would you say that 1920s consumerism impacted the Fitzgeralds? You know, the jazz age coming out of the Great War, it was actually, you know, prior to the Depression, kind of you know, known as a little bit more of a consumerist sort of society. So I just wonder, you know, would love your thoughts on that.
I think it has a huge impact on it because, I mean, they both came from fairly humble backgrounds. I mean, they were upper middle class, and they weren't for want, but they were you know, it was enough that the idea of more or living at a certain caliber. I mean, you can even see it when Scott describes Princeton. He just has this whole, like, it's on a pedestal, if you will. I mean, and I think that was the same with, you always talk about Zelda in New York, and then she kind of realizes, like, New York is kind of the turning point where she realizes this fantasy is different than the reality. But I think it was a huge, I mean, it was a huge factor in all, not only how they spent their money and how they lived their lives, but also how women were represented and how relationships were represented. I mean, this is when it was almost marketed, like dating was kind of being coined. It wasn't, you know, a regular thing for women to be fairly free in their relationships and kind of dictate their relationships. So even in that sense, you know, that is being marketed as a way to live. So I think, i.e. the flapper, if you will. So I think with them starting out so wealthy, it was like, yes, we're just going to take part in anything. And I think, again, it was status and celebrity. They were over the top, and they wanted to kind of maintain this illusion. Even they may not have wanted it. I think buying outside of their means was true even at the height of their wealth and celebrity. And once they weren't able to maintain that, they didn't know how else to function, you know.
Yeah.
I really, they surrounded themselves with all these people, and these people kind of, again, like with Hemingway and The Lost Generation and Stein and the Murphys, they maintained themselves well, and it was mainly Scott that wasn't as successful, So I think it was putting on airs, if you will. I really do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love in the book, Therese and Fowler starts her part 3 of the book with a Baudelaire poem that I just thought was really kind of perfectly illustrating, is great at illustrating sort of Scott and Zelda's, consumerism. It starts, always be drunk, that's it. The great imperative, in order not to feel time's horrible burden, weighing your shoulders down, grinding you into the earth. Get drunk and stay that way. On what? On wine, poetry, virtue as you please, but get drunk. And if you sometime happen to awake on the steps of a palace, in the green grass of a ditch, in the dismal loneliness of your own room, with your drunkenness gone or disappearing, ask the wind, the wave, the star, the bird, the clock. Ask everything that flees, everything that groans or rolls or sings, everything that speaks. Ask what time it is. And the wind, the wave, the star, the bird, the clock will answer you, time to get drunk. If you are not to be the martyred slaves of time, get drunk. Stay drunk on wine, poetry, or virtue as you please. And I think that definitely you see that through this story. And through especially probably their New York time, just after the wedding in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and the very lavish parties that they're throwing, and I mean throughout, and the story, they're just constantly getting drunk and having fun, and having these lavish, parties, and I think that goes back and to that sort of existential, side of things that, it's kind of life is to be enjoyed. That kind of idea of if this is the life we've got, if it's the only life we've got, life is to be enjoyed, and they definitely took, I think, Baudelaire's words to heart.
It's funny how you see all of the early. You can almost map out what they've been reading. Based on what they're talking about and how they're living at the time, which I think is really fascinating. That's one of the things I've been kind of documenting as I've been going through, which you can imagine it just is a constant rabbit hole of information. But both of them were extremely well read, and I think that's a huge part of who they were. I think any kid or any person that was a kid and just that was their escape and that was their way of kind of learning about the world, just like latches onto that immediately. I mean, I was certainly that kid. I just kind of read my way through my adolescence, and I think that was the same with them. I mean, you look, Scott kind of had a tragic childhood. I mean, 2 of his siblings passed away in the year that he was born, so he had a very lonely. His father was an alcoholic. He was mainly raised by his mother, and she was the wealthier and the more successful of the 2. So there was a weird little dynamic in his childhood. So I can, he kind of wrote it out. He did plays and all these theater productions even early on. He was first published at 13, which is fascinating. And even Zelda, I mean, we talked about her interview at 11 and, books like The Salamander, and you can see them just kind of pop up in their material afterwards. And it's awesome to kind of see the cycle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned theater, and I think, it'd be nice to kind of segue into the other theme that we often talk about in Becoming Bohemian on the website, blog, and in our book club. And then, that definitely played a part and a role in the book, and that's dance and the performing arts. You mentioned theater, and it seems that plays and, all the world's sort of a stage for Scott and Zelda, and there's a theme of them even playing a role or acting a part in life. You mentioned kind of the curation of their life, and what role would you say folklore sort of played in and sort of creating this folklore, and how did that play into their identities and their public persona?
Um, I think quite a bit. I mean, I think I think the idea of celebrity played a huge role in how they carried themselves, especially in the public. And again, kind of going back to what I said about them documenting their lives. I mean, there's almost so all of their scrapbooks. Just again, for all of your readers and everybody who loves F. Scott and Zelda, on the Princeton University Digital Library, all of their scrapbooks are available for you to kind of dig through. They're available to the public. So there's almost this, you can tell while they're documenting, there's almost this awareness that pops up where they're like, oh, somebody might be reading this. And they even talk about that with letters. So letters at the time with celebrities were often used kind of like tabloids. You know, we have this whole tabloid culture now where we don't have any privacy and we don't leave people alone. But then it was their letters. So people would intercept letters and publish them. So people almost wrote with this awareness that there was a third party reading them. And I think that's fascinating because that changes everything. You know, that changes the whole perspective. And they were very meticulous in that regard. You know, like they knew that they were documenting their lives. So it even with Scott. So Scott starts what he calls the thought book at the age of 8. And he documents flirtations with young women at his school or rivalries with friends of his and other young men. So even at that point, he's kind of making these little notes and lists about his life. And then throughout their marriage and throughout his career, he literally had a ledger for every day. And she was kind of the same way. I mean, there were, you know, there's always a diary entry or a letter or something documenting a photograph or something, you know, kind of documenting the time. And I think, but I think it's just part of who we are as people. You know, you only take the good photos, you only save the good photos. You don't save the ones of, you know, your kids crying necessarily. Some people do because that's real life. But at the same time, I think the folklore was ultimately their kind of demise. You know, I think if they had looked at themselves aside from everything else and who they were as people, they may have been, quote, normal. They could have just had quiet lives but I think it was this kind of fantasy, you know. They wanted to live the lives that they had thought about, you know, and they had ideals this whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In the book, Jim Ellis does an interview. I think he was one of Scott's friends, Princeton friends, and you know, during the course of the interview, Scott kind of put Zelda as if she's, you know, the role of the protagonist in his most recent book, and she kind of initially takes a little bit of umbrage because, you know, she says that's not really how it worked out, you know, after the interview is done, and he explains to her exactly what you were saying about, you know, they need to be aware, and the public doesn't know that, and the public will respond well, you know, if they think that you were sort of the muse for this book, and I think Zelda responds, so if I go along with this scheme, we'll be playing parts. That's what you're saying? Same as if we were doing this year's volleyball back home? And Scott handed me a glass of champagne. Only this time, we're writing the parts ourselves. So I think that definitely goes along with what you were saying. And I think it's true that in our day and age, we do kind of the same thing with social media. We kind of curate our own lives and show only the best pictures and only the, you know, the cool events that we go to, and that does
social media culture. they were playing into social media culture before it even existed.
Move over, Mark Zuckerberg. You know, this was the original Facebook. They had the original idea. Yeah. In fact, I think Scott goes on in the book to say that he wants to write a fictional interview that could be placed with the Times of Tribune. And he says that way we don't have to wait for the papers to decide if they want someone to do it. So he even is thinking of completely, you know, creating a fictional interview, this other bit of alter egoism, and I think it's interesting, you know, throughout the book that they're constantly alluding to playing the role or playing the part or saying the right line, and I agree with you. Just as you said, that probably led to their demise, and and certainly may have factored into Zelda's kind of, collapse and struggles, even if it wasn't truly schizophrenia or bipolar, generalized anxiety, whatever it may have been. I think it's got to be hard to live multiple lives, a public life and a private one, and so many different roles is challenging to keep that up and exhausting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, even now, I mean, Zelda is almost a picture of the modern female. It's like you need to be this modern woman and this wife and this demure woman and this, you can't be too ambitious, but we want you to be somewhat successful. You know what I mean? Like it's just this constant push and pull and balance. And, honestly, I think we all still struggle with that. It's like, how does the folklore play into our own identities? Who are we really?
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. And Zelda seems to dance through life, and dance plays this huge role in the book. She and Scott meet, after she's just performed a ballet solo, and she definitely seems to find ballet and dancing therapeutic. And I thought it was interesting that the initial panic attack, at least how it's presented in this narrative, in this book, happens shortly after she decided, kind of at Scott's insistence, not to dance professionally in Italy. And I guess I was wondering, is ballet the only form of dance that Zelda is known for doing? Because Isadora Duncan, obviously, and modern dance was just kind of coming into vogue at this time, and I guess I wondered if she ever sort of dabbled in other forms of dance.
Yeah, so this kind of plays in. I've been doing a deep dive of early Zelda, which has been really fun because you get more of the what she started out as, and then when you go back to ballet, so she performs in Montgomery quite a bit before her marriage, and I mentioned that her mother wrote some of the performances of the Follies that she performed in Montgomery. So and kind of digging through all of these, back in the day, everything was in the newspaper, even descriptions of houses and things. So that's what we've been kind of doing, is going back to see if we can find descriptions of the houses, including this one, and then even who was in town at the time. So with these, they're talking about, Zelda performed a Hawaiian dance. So in one case, she performs a Hawaiian dance, and another, it's a classic ballet. So I think she was influenced by modern elements of dance, because I think dancers naturally kind of gravitate to other forms of dance. Even if you're classically trained in ballet, you have influence of modern dance and jazz and all these other things. But I mean, look at where she's going after. So she starts very classically in a very southern kind of setting. She goes to New York, and I would imagine, this is the Charleston, and everybody's kind of breaking out in terms of how they're dressing and chopping off their hair, and so I don't expect Zelda to kind of sit on the sidelines in terms of what everybody else is doing in that sense. So I think absolutely modern dance would have been included. And then they go to Paris. So I mean, the Follies there. Of course, I hate to use this as the picture, the iconography of the time, but Dorothy Parker and her banana skirt, I mean, that's happening in Paris at the time. So there's even a reference by Picasso about Zelda dancing, and you always kind of wonder, if Picasso acknowledged it, what was she doing, So I think even though ballet was her true discipline and desire, that she certainly, like art, you can tell with her art, there's this shift in this very traditional sense to a more surrealist and kind of modern sense. And I think that's true with Zelda. She just had this kind of evolution on her own. And then in terms of her actual career, the Italian Company is one aspect of it, but Diaghilev was another aspect, and that was very modern for the time period. You look at some of the costumes and things; they were boxy and odd, and they weren't these beautiful flowing pieces. They were very modern and kind of paper dolls in their own sense. So I think a lot of that really plays into to all of it. I do think that ballet was kind of meditative in some sense. Having had a ballet background, I can see where she was trying to just center herself in some senses, because it is very much a discipline, not only of the mind, but you're immersed in classical music. And I don't know, I think it's, she even talks about in her novel, knowing that she's like working herself and bending her muscles in a way that you're not really supposed to. It's just part of it, So I think it's very much a mold mentally and physically, and just trying to be your best self in some way.
Yeah. I liked how, earlier when you'd mentioned the judge as sort of being the iron fortress, and, sometimes that impenetrable stubbornness, is kind of one side of that sort of metaphor, but I think the security that it provides is another. And I think I kind of wonder, as you were talking, that was that side of her that craved that security, right? And that ballet kind of is in many ways like that. It's sort of a torture chamber in some ways with supporting yourself on two.
It is. It absolutely is.
Structured, and and kind of bending your both your mind and body to the instructor's will, and but then having the beautiful classical music, but having that security in that sort of very regimented kind of form of dance. And I do wonder if it definitely provided that anchor, and it was kind of similar to the role that her father played in her life as being someone you could always, while they're stubborn, you always count on them. Sort of what they think. In fact, she kind of alludes to it through the book. What would the judge say, or I know the judge would do this, and so I think in some ways there is that security in having something that's very sort of secure, strong, stubborn.
Yeah.
And then yes, embracing maybe the freedom of modern dance and enjoying the Charleston, when at parties and things, but having the stable force of ballet as sort of the backbone of her dance exploration. I could see that as being something that's centering, like you said.
Yeah.
Interesting. Into writing, why would you say, Hemingway comes up, and it's so interesting. Previous to reading this book, I used to tell my friends that, had I been born in the right time period, which was, this time period that we're talking about, and not the time period that I'm in currently, I would have saved, Hemingway from suicide and 4 very troubled relationships. Really well. I loved his very strong writing style.
That's fantastic.
I always loved his work. And then I read this book and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't think I could have handled Hemingway. And he just was, not the man that I guess thought he was, at least how he's portrayed in this book. So I guess I was wondering. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead with your question. I'm very thrilled with this question. I was just waiting.
I was wondering why it seemed that, because it definitely seems that Scott was very much enamored in maybe the way that I was with Hemingway, and why was it that he seemed to be so dependent on Hemingway, and also seemed to, in some ways, give up his own sort of career in writing to sort of help Ernest, with his. It just seemed like a very interesting relationship, and I didn't fully understand it. So I'm hoping that you can maybe shed a light on their relationship.
Oh yeah. So equally fascinated with Scott and Hemingway, and depending on who you talk to, again, it's very much a one against the other type of situation, which I think is hilarious because they were really interwoven with each other's lives, and you look at kind of the arc of both of their careers and things. I mean, they're so in parallel with each other. It's kind of scary. But No, I am totally fascinated by I'm actually writing a paper about their whole relationship based on their correspondence because um, it is fascinating. I mean, they had a strong literary friendship. So, one thing to give you a little background, Scott is credited for, quote, discovering Hemingway. He read him before he was truly published as a novelist, and encouraged him to be represented by Scribner. So their initial meeting in Paris in 1925 is because of that kind of investigation into his work and that encouragement of his career, which is fascinating in itself. But then, as they meet in Paris together. They go on several trips together. They're meeting each other's friends. So Hemingway's introducing Scott to Stein and the Murphys, and then they're kind of trading, experiences. And Scott would even loan, the most fascinating thing during this period is that Scott would even loan him money at the beginning of his career. And Scott obviously is not, wealthy. He is in a constant state of financial decline. So that was kind of the signifier to me, like, oh, this is something different, because feasibly, if you don't have money, you're not loaning it to somebody that you don't care about. So I just went into, again, another rabbit hole of correspondence and hearing. So Maxwell Perkins is kind of the in-between of Scott and Hemingway. They would talk to him about each other, which is, again, fascinating. So I don't think he was necessarily dependent on him. I think they used each other and they critiqued each other's work, and that in itself is kind of a high or a drug for writers, that you need to know what your contemporaries think of you, and you need to have that criticism, and you have to have something to bounce ideas off of. So I think they were very much that person in both cases. Hemingway wouldn't even let Scott read some of his first novel because he wasn't ready for him to. So it's this careful relationship. It's very personal. Hemingway grieved with Scott. He's one of the only people he grieves with over his father's death and writes about it, which I think, again, is indicative of the closeness of their relationship. And their meeting in Paris was definitely a crux in both of their lives. I mean, obviously, Zelda and Hemingway did not get along on both sides. They pitted each other against they were jealous of each other for the closeness of their relationships, which is, again, indicative of how close Scott and Hemingway truly were. And then Hemingway would divorce Hadley in the same time period. So even though he's kind of judgmental of Scott and Zelda's relationship, his own relationship has crumbled at this point, and he's kind of moving on to his second wife. And again, he's admitting, he's telling this to Scott, and Scott's kind of consoling him and telling him, whatever you need. So the biggest aspect of their relationship is the infamous publishing. There are two cases where he kind of damns Scott publicly. One is an immovable feast with the infamous observation of Scott and analysis of him as a man. And then the other one is around the time of the crack-up, where he puts in print poor Scott Fitzgerald, and Scott comes back to him with this biting letter that's like, please don't put me in print and don't pity me that way. So when I came into this position, I assumed that was the end of their correspondence. They just had this infamous breakup. They didn't speak after that. So that's 1936. So that's 4 years before Scott dies. But the more I looked into it, they corresponded up until a month before Scott's death. And when they weren't writing each other, they were writing other people to check in, like Maxwell Perkins, or they were organizing a way to see each other in person. So I think even though on an outside perspective, Scott seems dependent, or almost as though he is the effeminate one, and Hemingway carried this masculinity in their relationship. And, they talk about they could have been lovers, and I mean, there's all these kind of strange little tangents that the Scott and Hemingway conversation can go. But I really think they were creatively and personally involved. I think they admired each other very much, and and I know this may sound a little odd, but post-war society, gender roles not really being defined in the way that they are now, it's very possible that they could have loved each other in a romantic sense. And I think that would have added confusion and, again, a polarization to the relationship because they weren't comfortable with it. So that's what I'm writing my paper on. So whenever I finish it, I'll be sure to send it your way.
I'd love to read it.
No, I was equally fascinated. I recently, on a kind of side note, I recently bought this fabulous jumpsuit that's very 40s, and I told somebody I felt like Martha Gellhorn in it, and nobody got it. But I could tell I was too deeply immersed in the Lost Generation for anybody to get my point.
Interesting you mentioned that. If you happen to be in the Bay Area next week, we are going to be going. There's an immersive theater experience done by the Palace Theater here in San Francisco that they recreate a speakeasy.
Oh, wow.
So in honor of sort of Halloween, we're all dressing up and going to be going to experience that, try to sort of transport ourselves back in time to that era. So
that's amazing.
Your jumpsuit, or if you can
I wish I would be in the Bay Area next week. I would absolutely put that on my agenda.
I know our time is coming to a close here. In fact, we're a little bit over the time that we'd agreed to, so I appreciate you taking your time. I did want to, before we go, ask just briefly about visual art, and at the end of the book, towards the end, Zelda has this gallery opening, and at the very end of the book, the author Therese Fowler mentioned that much of her artwork has been lost, and I was wondering if you've seen it or interacted with any of her artwork. I was trying to find it online to see if I could, actually experience her art kind of up close and personal.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have any of her works at the museum there, or have you ever seen them yourself?
We do, actually. We have, I want to say, close to 10 pieces. We have most of the florals that were done during her time at Johns Hopkins, which was mainly art therapy. So they're kind of traditional. They're not the more beautiful illustrations that she does later on that are, based on children's books and fairy tales and all these kind of fantastic things. We recently acquired a hand-painted Easter card. So she used to hand-paint these Easter cards for friends and family. So we recently tracked one down, and we did a Zelda gallery for her birthday in July. So we had vintage fashion and the new painting, and we had a designer from Austin kind of collaborate with us and her name is Sloan Lenz, but she recreated all of these pieces from the late 1800s and the 1920s and made them into these kind of modern takes on Zelda. So we had those on display, but so Zelda was known not only to paint on canvas, but she did these hand-painted bowls as well. They're these wooden kind of fruit bowls. So we have one of those, it's the red poppies, and then we have some perfume bottles. So they're these just little delicate kind of embellishments on these perfume bottles that she would do. So you can tell she kind of was creative, and she kind of touched on everything. We have an original woodland scene when she first started painting. So I always like to mention a lot of her earlier paintings are landscapes and again, very traditional in some sense. But when she starts her training or painting actively, she's again in the company of folks like Picasso, Dali, and Gerald Murphy, and they were all very accomplished painters and very modern in their own perspective. So you should see the shift when she comes back to Montgomery in the after Scott's death in the 1940s. All the scenes of New York and Paris and all the places that they've been, she's recreating. So I think the time period and the context is really interesting to those particular pieces. I will add that most of those on the Fitzgerald Trust recently released those online, so you can actually purchase prints on art.com. So a lot of the scenes of New York, Paris, a lot of the paper dolls, some of the later work. So I think the Star of Bethlehem, which is more of kind of a religious piece, is on there as well. So, and then some are housed at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. So even if you don't see them here, there's a collection at another fine arts museum in Montgomery as well. So there's actually 2 locations in Montgomery. But so I say all that to add, most of her paintings were burned after her death because her mother and sister considered them to be very eccentric, and even some of the people that she gifted to. I forget her last name, but her friend Zandra was based in St. Paul. There's the painting that she gifted to her was one of a woman nursing, but it has this, it's blue, and it has this striking, it's almost like a shawl. I think she indicated it as a shawl or like a blanket or something, but it's this huge red streak down the middle of it, and the way it looks, Zandra described it as disturbing, and I've only seen a picture of it, but you get this sense of like it isn't this maternal moment, it's something else. It's almost like the child is clawing at this woman. It's really kind of interesting. So you see there are elements of this kind of break in her mind, I guess, that come up in some of her paintings. Some of them are obviously very lighthearted and beautiful and come from a different place, but I believe Gertrude Stein, she gifted a painting to Gertrude Stein, and Stein wanted a different one. So she was ultimately unhappy with what she ended up with, and somehow it's ended up in the cosmos. So that's what I always say to people is you never know. She painted continuously for 24 years. If she was nearly as obsessive with her painting as she was about her ballet, there's really no telling how much work she could have produced in that amount of time. Additionally, she donated canvases to the military, so it's possible that these canvases are just floating out again in the cosmos somewhere. Yeah. And then it's rumored that, so when Scotty died in Montgomery, she basically let her friends walk through her home and pick what they wanted. And it's rumored that there are Zelda originals in some of the estates in the neighborhood that we're housed in. So I always tell people, keep your eyes peeled. It's a scavenger. This whole place is a scavenger hunt. Their lives are a scavenger hunt. Everything is everywhere. So if you ever run across anything, you never know.
Well, that's good to hear. Well, I'm definitely going to plan my trip out to visit you and to see those works. That sounds incredible. And it is interesting. You mentioned the work, the sort of period blue piece with the red shawl, the maternal or maybe not so maternal piece. And then you also mentioned Scotty at the end. And if I may ask one final question, it seemed that their relationship, Scotty and Zelda's, was not always a very, I guess, I don't know, a positive one, I guess, or it was a challenging one, I should say. I don't know if I want to say it wasn't positive, but it was a little bit challenging. At least it seemed that way through the book. Towards the end, it looked like there might have been kind of more of a reconciliation at the end, or they were a little closer, I guess. I don't know if reconciliation is the right word, but they were maybe closer towards the end. Was that true?
So Scotty, again, I'm going to give you guys another recommendation. Scotty's daughter, Eleanor Lanahan, wrote this book called Scotty, A Daughter Of, and I've recently been reading it, and Scotty is such a striking character in this whole thing because, she's kind of a side note, but she very much asserts herself independently of her parents and never, ever has a bad word to say about them, which I think is astonishing because she could have easily kind of gone on that tangent of, they were alcoholics and frivolous and et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at Zelda and Scotty, so Zelda and Scotty and Scott and Scotty are two different things. Scott and Scotty, there was kind of this criticism with her and that he didn't want her to be a writer, and Zelda was hospitalized for a majority of the time, so he was her initial caretaker, and then eventually she went into the care of his literary agent, Harold Ober, around 12 or 13. So there's kind of a break that happens in her adolescence, which I think is really significant when you look at both of their relationships with their parents. And her mother, with Zelda, I mean, early on, even in Zelda's novel, Scotty is very prevalent in her thoughts and in her documentation of her life. She wanted to be a good mother, and I don't think she just knew how to be domestic. I don't say that in an insulting way. I just don't think, with her being such a creative person, that domesticity just did not fit her. And that's not to say that she wasn't an attentive or a good mother, but so many things were happening around the time that Scotty was really growing and developing, and because of their status, it was easy to have a nanny or a caretaker or somebody else take that on. So I think it did ultimately create kind of a ripple in their relationship. But again, you acknowledge them having a closeness toward the end, and I think that's the biggest thing. And I think, again, this only adds, mothers and daughters are complicated. I think we all know that. So I think that's the biggest thing. I mean, it's going to be what it is. It's not dependent on one person or the other in the relationship. It's just how you kind of navigate it together. And ultimately, with them kind of coming together in the end and having this understanding, I think, I think the mental health aspect was the biggest part, because she just couldn't see herself in that role, and she wanted to be an encourager and to show Scotty the world, and to have this life that she didn't have. And I think that's true of any mother, honestly. You're trying to give your children the opportunity to be more than you were. And ultimately, in some way, they're never really going to live up to that. And even as a child, you're never really going to live up to that expectation. So Scotty very much identified herself separately from her parents. She took a different route. She was involved in politics, and she wrote, but it wasn't, it wasn't fiction. It was about her life, and she took a very serious kind of perspective on everything that she did, and she's very much like her parents. I think that's very much Zelda, and that she would never let anyone make an assumption about her, and that's Zelda 100%. But no, I would, having read more about her, she's equally as fascinating, and I think she, in herself, is an iron fortress for having gone through all of that throughout her childhood and come out a whole person, and to be a successful person. But that's just personal opinion.
I appreciate the personal opinion, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking me to do it. It's been a pleasure. I told you via email, but I'll tell you in our interview that I appreciated how in-depth your questions were, because normally it's very on the surface. So it was a nice deep dive and analysis for me to kind of brush up on my Fitzgerald facts.
Thank you. And I guess in the spirit and the tone of the book, in the last sentence, it says, "There's no need for me to be present, and I'm not saying goodbye." And I feel that here. Even though I know we're a distance apart, Sara, you're in Alabama, I'm here in San Francisco. Even though we're not present together in the same room, in the same space, I just really appreciate this time that we've been able to share together. And I'm not saying goodbye, because I do plan to come on out to Alabama and get to see you. And I hope that if you come this way, that we'll get to reconnect again as well.
Absolutely. That sounds fantastic. And I found, oddly enough, that anytime I meet anybody through the museum or at the museum, we ultimately establish a relationship that is long-term. So I look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are listening, In the Belly of Paris by Émile Zola is next month's book. So we'll be feasting on that. So be sure to get started soon, and we will see everyone next month. Thank you again, Sara. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to catching up under the magnolia tree in Alabama.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.